have 2 presenters this morning and 3 respondents. An odd way that worked out perhaps, but from very, very different disciplinary perspectives. So welcome all of you to our first panel of 3 today in the Studying Religion Across the Disciplines Conference. This morning's panel is entitled Religion, Ethics, and Psychology. Our first speaker to my far right here is Joshua Green. Joshua Green is the John and Ruth Hazel Associate Professor of the Social Sciences and the Director of the Moral Cognition Lab in Harvard University's Department of Psychology. His work focuses on the intersection of psychology, neuroscience, and moral philosophy. His research has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, and the MacArthur Foundation. Green has appeared on Charlie Rose and Scientific American Frontiers, and his work has been featured in the New York Times, Discover Magazine, WNYC's Radio Lab, and NPR's Morning Edition. In keeping with our tradition of yesterday, I'm going to introduce all of the speakers and the respondents and then sit down and get out of their way. Our second speaker to my right is James Nelson. Jim Nelson was born and raised in Spokane, Washington. He received graduate training in theology at Fuller Theological Seminary and then did his doctoral work in clinical psychology at Washington State University, where he specialized in medical psychology and neuropsychology. After completing his doctoral work, he joined the faculty of Valparaiso University in 1987 and is an associate professor in the departments of psychology and in international studies. He has also held appointments as a visiting scholar at the University of California, Los Angeles, and the University of Notre Dame, as well as Zhejiang University in Hangzhou, China. Dr. Nelson is an active researcher with interests that lie on the border between psychology and other fields like biology, philosophy, theology, and cultural studies. His current empirical work focuses on the relationship between spirituality and addiction. Turning to my left, our first respondent is Justin Fifield, who is a PhD candidate in South Asian religions here at the Committee on the Study of Religion, with a primary focus on Buddhist literature in Sanskrit. He's particularly interested in narrative as a genre of literature and as a mode of religious and ethical discourse. His work combines a fine-grained analysis of language and narrative structures with a hermeneutic sensitive to the function of literature within South Asian religious traditions. Beyond this specialized focus, he's also deeply interested in the study of religion more broadly as an academic discipline into the comparative study of religious traditions. Our second responder in the middle is Richard Weisbord. Richard is a lecturer at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where he directs the Human Developmental and Psychology program, and is a lecturer at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. His work focuses on moral development, vulnerability, and resilience in childhood, and effective schools and services for children. With Stephanie Jones, he directs the Making Caring Common project, a national effort to make moral and social development priorities in child raising and to provide strategies to schools and parents for promoting, in child caring, a commitment to justice and other key moral and social capacities. He's currently conducting research on how older adults can better mentor young adults and teenagers in developing ethical, mature, romantic relationships. He is a founder of several interventions for at-risk children, including Read Boston and Write Boston, in which my niece has participated recently, a citywide literacy initiatives led by Mayor Menino. With Robert Selman, he founded Project Aspire, a social and ethical development intervention in schools. He's also a founder of a pilot school in Boston, the Lee Academy, that began with children at 3 years of age. He's advised the city, state, and federal levels on family policy and social reform, and has written for numerous scholarly and popular publications and blogs, from the New York Times to the Huffington Post and Psychology Today. His most recent book, The Parents We Mean to Be, How Well-Intentioned Adults Undermine Children's Moral and Emotional Development, cautionary tale to everyone, out in Mifflin 2009, was named by The New Yorker as one of the top 24 books of 2009. And then last but not least, our final respondent.
So long, but...
Yeah, no, it's okay. I cut out some of it. And last but not least, our final respondent will be Mara Willard. Mara is a lecturer here at Harvard Divinity School, where she has taught courses on Christian ethics and political history, including the course Religion in American Public Life, for which she's twice received teaching awards from our teaching center. Mara is also interested in literary arts as sites of social critique and moral imagination. She's currently completing a research project on Hannah Arendt that bridges these interests with democratic and feminist theory and European philosophy of religion. She received a BA in distinction from Swarthmore College and holds an MDiv from Harvard Divinity School and a PhD in the study of religion from the Harvard Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. In fall 2014, we're very happy to hear she will become a tenure-track assistant professor in Christian studies at the University of Oklahoma. So please join me in welcoming all of our presenters and respondents. And Professor Green,
Thank you so much for having me here. It's really a great pleasure, and I'm really curious to hear your thoughts about what I'm going to say, especially since it's probably not the usual fare that you're used to, a scientific perspective on morality and its relationship to religion. I have to make an apology, especially to the respondents, which is that I've changed some stuff. And the good news is that instead of just giving my cookie cutter book talk, it's actually more closely related to your specific interests, at least some of you, and to the topic at hand. But the bad news is you're going to have to wing it a little bit, at least if you want to respond to certain aspects of it. But if there's a bit of a disconnect between what I say and what they say, it's my fault and not theirs. So thanks for your patience with that. So is this on now, or should I?
See your first slide.
Oh, I have to. What do we do? Is that right? There we go. Okay, that's the title. So I'm going to rather quickly, I have like a half an hour or something like that, try to get across three very general ideas. So the first idea is what I call the tragedy of common sense morality. The second is this idea of morality fast and slow. And then finally, this idea of common currency. So starting with the tragedy of common sense morality, it actually begins with a more familiar tragedy, which comes from the ecologist Garrett Hardin. And his parable is known as the tragedy of the commons. And it's really, I think, the clearest illustration of the basic problem of cooperation, which I think is the basic problem of social existence from molecules and cells on up to human society. So Hardin's parable goes like this. You have all these herders who share this common pasture, and these are self-interested, rational herders straight out of the economics department who ask themselves the following question: should I add more animals to my herd? And they think, well, if I have more animals, that's more money I get when I sell my goods at market. That's good. What's the downside? Not much downside. They're just grazing on this common pasture, so bring them on. We'll add more animals and more animals, but you know how this goes. At some point, there are more animals than the commons can support. All the animals die, and everybody ends up being worse off. And that is the tragedy. And it's essentially a problem of individual interest versus collective interest, of me versus us. The irony is that each of these herders is doing what is in his, in some cases perhaps her, best interest. No matter what the other people are doing, you're better off adding more animals to your herd, at least as long as there's some commons left. But if everybody does that, everybody ends up being worse off. And that is the general problem of public goods, of cooperation, and you see the same problem when it comes to issues of pollution or having nuclear weapons or whatever it is. It's the social problem arises when individuals do what makes sense for them selfishly, but not what's good for the collective. So what's the solution? Well, the solution, I think, in the broadest sense, is morality. That is, having some concern for the interests of other people and not just for yourself. But even just leaving it at that doesn't really solve the problem. There are all kinds of questions that have to be resolved about the specific terms of cooperation. So how are sheep going to be allotted? Every family gets the same number. Every individual gets the same number. What happens if your sheep get sick? Do we have collective health insurance for that? What happens if somebody tries to hurt your sheep? Can you fight them off with an assault weapon? There are all kinds of questions about the terms of cooperation that go beyond simply saying, okay, we're not going to be completely selfish, we're going to cooperate. And that gives rise to the tragedy that I really want to talk about, which I've called the tragedy of common sense morality, which is illustrated by my sequel to Hardin's parable. So the sequel goes like this. So over here, we have a group of herders, and they've decided to solve the me versus us problem like this. They're going to be communists. So they say, instead of not only are we going to have a common pasture, we're just going to have a common herd. Everything's going to be in common, and that way there's no tension between me and us. It's really just all about us. Now, in practice, we know that this doesn't always work out so well, but it is a strategy for solving the original tragedy of the commons, to basically subjugate me to the larger us. Another approach is the free market capitalist approach over here. So what we're doing here is these herders are saying, not only are we not going to have a common herd, we're not going to have a common pasture. We're going to privatize the commons. Everybody is responsible for themselves. We just divide it up into different plots. And that's another way to solve the problem. We basically say we're going to make it as me-ish as possible as long as everybody sort of stays out of each other's way. And it's not that these people aren't cooperative, but their cooperation consists in respecting each other's property rights and not interfering. Two different ways of solving the problem. Now, there are other ways that tribes, as I like to call them, can differ. And this is the one that's most relevant to us, is tribes can rally themselves around what I call different proper nouns. Different gods, different texts, different institutions, religious or secular or whatever it is, that almost every single society, and the larger they get, the more this is true, has some kind of centralized legal authority, some set of institution that says, this is how we do stuff around here. And tribes differ in who they listen to, who the authorities are, and what those authorities say. And they have different rituals that govern their life, different norms, different rules or ideas about things like, can women be herders, for example? Over here, maybe they say yes. Over here, maybe they say no, or vice versa, right? So all these different ways in which a tribe can solve that basic cooperation problem of getting the individuals to form a group and to put us ahead of me. So now, imagine that one hot, dry summer, the forest here burns down, and suddenly there's this lovely pasture in the middle after the rains come, and both of these tribes look at this pasture and say, hey, nice pasture. And they want to move in and enjoy those lovely resources. This is the modern world in one goofy slide. That is, the modern world consists of many different tribes with their own systems for solving the basic tragedy of the commons, their own systems for being cooperative, varying in dimensions such as how individualistic or collectivist are they, what are their attitudes towards punishing people, what are their attitudes towards outsiders, what do their gods, their leaders, their texts say about how daily life is supposed to be organized, who's allowed to do what we do with our time and what we don't do with our time. And the question is, when all of these tribes come together, and it's not just two, and occupy a common space, how are they going to get along? Now, for most of human history, it's just been, well, one of these tribes just destroys the other tribe. But what we're trying to do today is get along in a way that allows us to, in some sense, preserve our cultural or our tribal identities, but at the same time, live peacefully together. And that is the modern moral problem, and I think that's much more complicated. It's not about me versus us, primarily. Everyone agrees you shouldn't be completely selfish. Not everybody does it, but you shouldn't. It's really about the terms of cooperation. What are the rules? What are the values? What are the principles that are going to govern the nature of our unselfishness and the limits of our unselfishness? And that brings me to the second idea that I want to talk about, which I'll connect with this later, and this idea of morality fast and slow. Now, some of you have probably heard this term fast and slow. If you've heard of Daniel Kahneman's book, for example, Thinking Fast and Slow. So my preferred analogy for this idea is this camera that I got years ago when my son was born. And the good thing about a camera like this for me is that it's got these automatic settings that make it really easy for someone who doesn't know what he's doing to take reasonably good pictures. So you want to take a picture of a mountain from far away in broad daylight, you put it in landscape mode, or for other things you can put it in portrait mode or close-up mode. Point and shoot works pretty well. Every once in a while I get ambitious, I want to do something fancy. That doesn't work with an automatic setting, and I can put the camera in manual mode. And I can adjust the f-stop and everything myself and do exactly what I want. And this is a really nice design for a camera because it allows you to navigate the trade-off between efficiency and flexibility. Most of the time, point and shoot works. I'm not doing anything special. The manufacturer already knows what I have in mind, and they've got a button for that. They've got an app for that, you might say. Right? Whereas, but then on occasion when I want to do something fancy, I need the flexibility to give it exactly what I want. Well, it turns out the human brain has basically the same design. And our automatic settings are our gut reactions. They're largely our emotional intuitions about what's good or what's bad or what's right or what's wrong. And those are very efficient, but they're not very flexible. At least not in the moment, over long periods of time perhaps. And then we have a manual mode. And our manual mode is our capacity for explicit reasoning, where we think about the specifics of the situation in front of us, reason from the possible actions we could take, and the causal chains that would lead to different desired or undesired effects, and allow us to decide what is actually going to get us what we want in this particular situation with the specific facts and options that we have. So let me apply this idea of morality, fast and slow, to the original tragedy of the commons, the basic me versus us problem. And this is an experiment done with David Rand and Martin Novak. So the laboratory version of the tragedy of the commons is what's known as the public goods game. So it goes like this. You have 4 players, let's say, details can vary. They come into the lab, everybody gets $10. And here's the deal. You can keep all $10, or you can put your $10 into a common pool, or you can put half of it, whatever you want. And then whatever goes into the pool gets doubled by the experimenters, and it gets divided evenly among all 4 people. So if you're all about me, if you're totally selfish, what you do is you keep your $10, because then you get your $10, plus a quarter of whatever got put into the pool and doubled by other people. That is, if you do the math, that's how you maximize your take in a one-shot game. If you're completely us-ish, if what you really care about is how well the group does as a whole, then you'll put all of your money in, because that maximizes the amount that productively gets doubled by the experimenters. And so what we wanted to know is, what kind of thinking, fast or slow, or both or neither, is it that makes people be selfish? And what kind of thinking is it that makes people be cooperative? And you might think, well, human animals are really basically selfish. We just want the stuff for ourselves. But then our higher faculty of reason enables us to say, no, I should be good. I should put into the pool for other people. You might think that we're basically intuitively good, but that when we get thinking a little bit too much, we get greedy and we get selfish. Or maybe you might think there's no tension between these things at all, or that there's no particular pattern to discern. So let's find out. Well, the first thing you can do is just look at people's decision times. And what we find is, so this is how much do people contribute. At least in some samples, the faster you go, the more likely you are to contribute. So what this says is that goes against the idea that our first impulse is to be selfish, and then we think and end up being cooperative. It suggests the opposite. Our first impulse is to be cooperative, to do nicely to others. But if you think about it more, you're more likely to you're more likely to keep your money for yourself. Now, I'll say this doesn't hold across every single population, and that's an interesting point we'll get to later. Now, that's a correlation. We can do a controlled experiment where we actually move people around. So this is how much people give on average in this sample when they don't have any time constraint. If we tell them you have to go fast, you have to decide within 10 seconds, contributions go up. You tell people, take your time, you have to think for at least 10 seconds, contributions go down. So consistent with this idea that it's really a fast thinking gut reaction that is predominantly making people cooperate, and slow thinking that can perhaps get in the way. Now, what I just described is just one example from my own work, but it's really a stand-in for a much larger set of literature that emphasizes this point, which is that what enables us to solve the basic tragedy of the commons are pro-social gut reactions. And you can think of these as falling into 4 categories. So we have the psychological carrots, psychological sticks that we apply to ourselves and that we apply to others. So on the positive side, so the carrots we apply to ourselves is we have love and friendship and goodwill towards others. And those basic pro-social feelings that we have towards others make us willing to make that sacrifice and put our money in the pool. We have negative feelings that we apply to ourselves. I would be ashamed, I would feel so guilty, especially if everybody else were to put their money in and I were the one who kept it, right? Other motivating, you will have my gratitude. Who knows what wonderful favors I'll do for you if you do nice things for me and for other people. And you will have my anger and my contempt and disgust if you're the person who doesn't put your money in and the rest of us do. And so all of these feelings enable us to be cooperative, to think not just about me, but to think about us. Okay, well, this is the real complicated problem, and this is the more interesting problem. And what I want to do now is talk about the psychology, how the psychology of morality plays out in the modern world, and then this is the stuff that you didn't get, and I apologize again for that. Talk a little bit about how religion plays into this. And the answer, my answer to this is an answer that a lot of people share. For example, a wonderful book developing this idea is David Sloan Wilson's book, Darwin's Cathedral. There's the idea that what religion really is it's a cultural cooperation device. It's a kind of cultural technology for enabling tribes to solve the basic cooperation problem. But at the same time, it helps those tribes solve the cooperation problem within group, but not necessarily across groups. And that's why religion, I think, can be so wonderful and helpful, but also so divisive and problematic. So what I'm going to do now, well, first I'm going to show you one place where I think our intuitions really fail us on the new pastures of the modern world. And then I'm going to talk about some research specifically on religions, most of it not my own, a little bit of my own, that brings to light the sort of two-faced, double-edged nature of religious thought. So here's first a philosophical thought experiment. The original version of this comes from the philosopher Peter Singer. This version comes from Peter Unger. Suppose you're driving along and you see that there's this guy who's bleeding by the side of the road. And you pull over and he says, "Please help me, take me to the hospital. I may lose my leg." And you say, "Well, I'd really like to help this person, but I just got new upholstery in my car, nice leather. This guy's going to bleed all over the place. I'm going to have to replace that. I'll let him go. Maybe someone else will pick him up." How many of you think it would be okay to let this guy bleed by the side of the Divinity school, right? How many of you are let you bleed by the side of the road because you're worried about your leather seats? How many of you think this would be morally horrible? Right? Okay. Well, you don't like to pass judgment, but okay. Next case. You get a letter from the mail from Oxfam or UNICEF or the Red Cross or some other worthy international aid organization and say, "Look, there are these people on the other side of the world who are desperately in need of food and medicine. Please make a donation so that we can help them. You might be able to save someone's life with a relatively modest donation." And you say, "Well, I'd like to help these people, but I was going to put some new leather in my car, and I think I'll save the money for that." How many of you think that you're morally monstrous if you choose to spend your money on some, it doesn't have to be leather seats, but some luxury that's nice to have but that you don't really need for yourself when you could use it to save the lives or possibly save the lives of desperate people on the other side of the world? How many of you think that's morally monstrous? Right? A little bit, sheepishly. How many of you live that way? Right? I know. I mean, I do. I tried more than most, but not as well as I could. So this is Peter Singer's paradox, and what he said is these two things, this and this, are not as different as we think. And that it may be, and then this is the further scientific bit, it may be a kind of holdover of the limitations of our moral thinking that make us feel like these things are so terribly different. Now, if you're a philosopher and you want to justify your intuitions, then what you do is you look at this and you say, "Well, I can do a little fancy philosophizing. Here's what's going on in this case. Here, you're the only one who can help. Right? Whereas here, there are a lot of people who could help these places. So you have a strong obligation there, and not in this case. But then, if you're another smart philosopher like Peter Singer, you say, "Well, suppose there are a bunch of cars lined up by the side of the road here, and they're all not helping. Now is it okay to let the guy die just because there are other people there who are not helping?" You say, "Well, that doesn't sound right." And you can go back and forth like this for 30 years, which is what philosophers have done. What I want to do is do an actual controlled experiment to get at what is driving the intuition behind it. So this is done with a wonderful undergraduate named Jay Musin. In our version, we asked people something like this. We said, suppose that there are these people on the other side of the world. Oh, no, sorry. You're vacationing in this lovely but poor country. You have your little cottage up in the mountains overlooking the coast, and a terrible typhoon hits, much like the one that devastated the Philippines not too long ago. And there's terrible misery along the coast. There's flooding. People are desperately in need of food and medicine. And you can help, but the best thing for you to do is not to go down there yourself, but to just make a donation, let's say, to the Red Cross. And you actually still have internet, believe it or not, in your cottage, and you can make a donation online. Do you have an obligation to make a donation to help these people on the coast below? In our sample, most people, 68% of people said that you have an obligation to help. Then we give a different group of randomly chosen subjects almost the same question. We say, you're not there, your friend is there in this other country. You're home here, let's say, in the United States, and your friend has a smartphone and is showing you everything that's going on. You know everything your friend knows. You can see everything your friend sees. You hear everything your friend hears. And you can help just as much. You can make a donation as well. So same situation, except you're farther away, essentially. Now, if you ask people, do you have an obligation to help, 34% of people say that you do. It seems like our gut reactions are very sensitive to what looks like just mere physical distance. Now, and that's not something that we ordinarily think of as being morally important. Should I save this person's life? Well, how many feet away is this person, right? Now, why? From a normative perspective, it's very hard to justify this difference. But biologically, this makes perfect sense. We evolved to live in a tribe. we evolved to live in a relatively small group where the people who you can help are right in front of you, and that favor is likely to be returned in some way, directly or indirectly, and to confer benefits on you. We did not evolve to cooperate with and to be kind to people on the other side of the world. Doesn't mean we can't, but that's not what we biologically evolved to do, as much as it would be nice if it were true. So this pattern makes perfect biological sense, even if it doesn't really make a lot of moral sense from our own, I'd like to think, more enlightened perspective. Okay, so what about religion? So this is a study done by Azim Sharif and Aaron Norenzayan, two leading scholars of the cognitive psychology of religion. Very simple study. They use what's called a dictator game, which is really just you get a certain amount of money and you can keep it all or give it to some anonymous person. How much do you give? And they did something very simple. They had people unscramble little anagrams like this, where you put the words in the right order to make a complete sentence, and half the time in the experimental condition, it ends up being something about God or divinity. So in this case, it was the desert was divine, if you saw that. And so some people got a bunch of these religious, divinity-oriented things to unscramble, and some people just got completely neutral ones. And then the question is, how much of their $10 do they give? And what you find is that the people who get the religious primes, who are just undoing these puzzles, and they don't know that they're being primed with religious concepts. They just are just solving these puzzles. They gave over twice as much money to the other person. So what this indicates, and I'm sure this is not a shock to any of you, is that thinking about certain religious ideals, even unconsciously, can make you more generous towards people around you. So that's good. And this will be one of the studies that I'll show you that's making religion look good. And then I'm going to show you some studies that make religion look bad. And we'll try to make sense of it all. So here's another one where makes religion look good. So this is an analysis, some of you may be familiar with this research, of religious versus secular communes in the 19th century in the United States. And the gist of this is a survival curve. What you see is these are the religious ones and these are the secular ones. And the religious communes survive a lot better. Pretty simple. This is over years. I mean, and not just a little better, a lot. I mean, the area under this curve is many times larger than the area under that curve. Why is that? Well, the idea is that it's like playing that dictator game over and over again with those religious primes. That when you have a group that is bound together by a shared sense of religious ideals, that creates a sense of community, and where people look out for each other and they help each other out, and that enables the group to survive in what can be pretty difficult circumstances. So again, consistent with the familiar idea that religion is really about community, and that religion is about not just thinking about yourself, but being concerned for others. And it seems to really, really work in a big way in the real world. This one's a little bit mixed. Again, this is Sharif and Norenzayan, and then Sharif and Remtella. I thought this study was fascinating. World Values Survey happens to include questions on, do you believe in heaven or do you believe in hell, or something to that effect. What they did was just subtract the average values of those two questions for each country. So basically, how much more in a country do people believe in hell versus heaven, or heaven versus hell? And what they found is that difference is highly predictive of crime rates across nations. It accounts for about 50% of the variance in crime rates. And this is not like a little sample. This is, and it's across religions. So green, Roman Catholic, blue, Muslim, for example. Really strong. I mean, this is nothing that I've seen predicts crime rates like this. It's really quite amazing. And what their hypothesis is, and this is consistent with lab studies, is that actually the belief in hell is really about keeping people in line. That if you really believe in hell, it really makes you good. Now you might say the belief in heaven is also about that. Carrot stick can do the same thing, but they say no. Heaven is about marketing, and hell is about the survival of the community. Hell is what keeps people in mind. Heaven is what brings people in, right? And if you let your hell get too far, if your heaven gets too far ahead of your hell, then you have a lot of people coming in, but they're not bound enough to the community. Now that may be the opposite of what you'd want to hear, right? A nice religion sounds like one where we believe in heaven, we don't really believe in hell or whatever. But what this suggests is, again, religion, maybe not the parts of it you like most, or maybe you like hell, I don't know, are very functional in terms of promoting what you might call good behavior. But other aspects are really more about spreading about spreading the belief. So this one you might say is mixed, but in any case you can draw your own conclusions about it. Okay, So I described the public goods game before, the game where everybody can put their money in or not. So this has been around for a while, and people have done these public goods games in different places all around the world. So this is a wonderful study by an economist named Benedict Herman and his colleagues. And in their version, they had people do a repeated version of the game. So everybody puts their money in or not, see how it happens, and then after each round, people have the opportunity to punish other players. So how do you do that? Well, you pay $1 to the experimenter, and then the experimenter takes away $3 from whoever you want. So it's the economic equivalent of bapping somebody on the head with a stick. And so they do several rounds of this. And the amazing thing is that you have people in different cities around the world play the exact same game, and the outcomes are wildly different. Exactly the same economic opportunities. Everybody makes sure they understand the game, and you get very different results. So in some places, like our own lovely Boston and Copenhagen in Denmark, contributions start out very high, and they stay pretty high all the way across. In places like Seoul and Melbourne and Chengdu, contributions start out reasonably high, and then the people who aren't contributing, they get bapped on the head economically, and cooperation ramps up, and by the end it looks like lovely Copenhagen. And then there are other places where cooperation isn't that high to begin with, and then it doesn't even ramp up like this, and you get these very unfortunate relative to your finishing points in places like Istanbul and Riyadh and Athens. Of course, this is not the whole population that's playing, but as I'll tell you in a second, the results are consistent with much broader sample data from the World Values Survey. So what is going on here? Why are they starting out low, and why are the punishers not bringing up the slackers in the way they are, let's say, in Melbourne? What they discovered here is that there's some other force at work. It's here the cooperators punish the people who aren't cooperating. Here, just as often, the people who are not cooperating are punishing the cooperators. Yes, you heard me correct. Why would they do that? So they interview these people. You're punishing these people for giving you money and giving other people money. What is your problem? They'd say, I don't like this little game. I don't like the way you got this set up. I don't know who these people are. I don't know who you are. I don't like this whole thing. And it's just basically a way of sticking up your middle finger to the whole setup, right? And it's too bad, because these people could have walked away with a lot more money, and they didn't. Now, if you look around the world at these cities, this antisocial punishment is the best predictor of how well these people do. And now this is interesting. What I showed you before, it's the religious communes that are surviving. It's the secular communes that are dying, right? But now look at this. Here's secular Copenhagen, where most people don't believe in God, right? And they're doing very well. And you've got places like Riyadh and Muscat, where a lot of people believe in God, and it's much more a religious culture, and they're walking away sorry. So what's going on here? I think that this is the difference between the two tragedies. That is, those communes, the religious communes, are doing a wonderful job of solving the tragedy of the commons, but they're not doing a great job. The religious groups, not all of them, but a lot of them, religious cultures are not doing a great job, not around Harvard Divinity School, of course, but elsewhere, of dealing with the higher level modern tragedy, the tragedy of common sense morality. So what does solve that problem? Well, what again the same research group says is it's largely secular institutions. So atheists are widely distrusted. And if you ask people, do you trust atheists? They say, they say, yes, I don't really like atheists very much. If you remind people about the effectiveness of police protection and things like that. So this is another prime. So you're priming, in one study they were priming people with religious ideas. Here we're priming people with the ideas of secular institutions such as courts and police that enforce nice behavior, or at least not mean behavior. Now distrust of atheists goes down, and it's specific for atheists. If you look at prejudice against gays, this police prime has no effect. And what it seems, what happens in large-scale societies that are largely secular, it's secular institutions that have taken over this role to a large extent of promoting cooperation, especially cooperation at a higher level where you have members of traditionally different tribes trying to live together in that common space. Okay, so now I said I started to, but now I'm really going to give you some research that makes religion look bad. So this is, and it's my own research. Sorry. This is. I mean, it doesn't. Whether you see it as good or bad, that's up to you. But at least some people see it this way, and they're not crazy. So this is with Amitai Shenhav and David Rand again. So we gave people what's called the cognitive reflection test, which involves questions like this. A bat and a ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Now, how many people's first thought was that it's 10 cents? Come on, everybody fixed 10 cents first, right? That's not the right answer, but the right answer is 5 cents. And if you do the math, you figure it out. But the test has all these questions where there's an obvious answer that's wrong, but it's not that hard to get it right if you think about it. You just have to not trust that first thought and be a bit more reflective and be willing to question that first thought. So this is a nice, how well people do on these problems is a nice measure of how reflective people tend to be. To what extent do they just go with their first thought, and to what extent are they more likely to question it and think and perhaps arrive at a different conclusion? Well, it turns out that the more of these tricky math problems that people get right, the less likely people are to believe in God. And here's a chart of I have had an experience that convinced me that God exists. If you get if this is doing this backwards, so this is number of intuitive responses on the CRT. So if you're getting all three of those problems wrong, you were about 60% saying yes, I've been convinced by my experience that God exists. Whereas if you get them all right, you're down at about 40%. Now these are of course just averages, but as you can see, this is a very pretty tight relationship. And then this is about change in belief in God over time. So you might just say that this is just a correlation with people who happen to do well in the math problems have certain kinds of cultural backgrounds or whatever. But this is about change. So if you get all of the problems wrong, you are more likely to have report being more religious than you were in childhood. And if you get all the problems right, you're more likely to report being less religious than childhood. So on the one hand, religion seems to be this force that enables people to cooperate and enables the community to survive. But it also can be a force that, at least in some contexts, gets in the way of cooperation, perhaps at a higher level. And it seems that, for better or worse, people who tend to be very reflective are likely to be rejecting religion, or at least rejecting a belief in God. So how do we put those things together? How do we make sense of this? Now I want to talk about this final idea of common currency and talk about two different philosophical traditions that I think have arrived at similar conclusions by rather different means. How am I doing on time?
Time to wrap it up.
Time to wrap it up. All right. Well, I'm going to have to. Am I like at the end, or I have like 5 minutes? I'm past. Oh, jeez. Wow. I'm so sorry. Okay. So morality solves the basic problem in an intuitive kind of way. What we need in the modern world, I think, is something like meta-morality. That is a higher order moral system and it's going to have to be manual mode because it's our intuitions that are dividing us here. Wow. All right. I'm really in trouble. John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham essentially propose what I would call a meta-morality. And what they say is that we should be maximizing happiness impartially. Everybody counts the same, not just you, not just your neighbor, but everybody in the whole world, and ultimately it's the quality of people's experience that matters. Now this is a very controversial idea. I think it's a widely misunderstood idea. I think it's led to a lot of good, so Jeremy Bentham here penning one of the first defenses of what we now call gay rights in the 18th century. And if you read these quotes, which you won't have time to do, you can see the kind of dual process, emotion, reason, battle going on with them, and they're favoring reason, and as a result favoring gay rights here, women's rights here. Boy, all right. Maybe I should just cut this off. Let me get so. A lot of the work that I've done is use these little moral dilemmas. So this trolley is headed towards these 5 people. You turn the trolley away from the 5 and onto the 1. Most people say yes, and what a lot of research shows is that you have a kind of rational response that says, well, better to save more lives. Here, not much of a gut reaction. When you get this case, is it okay to push this guy off of the footbridge onto the tracks? So he'll die, but it'll save the 5 people. Most people say no to this. Why? Well, they get the cost-benefit rationale, but there's a strong emotional response that makes people say no. And this is consistent with their kind of view. This sort of supports the Kantian kind of view that I'm not going to have to talk about. I'll skip the neurological evidence for this theory. Brain lesion patients, brain imaging, people who do better on the cognitive reflection test are more likely to say that it's okay to push the guy off the footbridge. What is that intuition about? Well, is it okay to push the guy off the footbridge? No. How about if you're just dropping the guy through a trapdoor with a switch? Oh, now it's okay. About twice as many people say. So the intuition is not necessarily being driven by exactly what we want it to be. Do you care? So, 60% of people say it's okay to drop the guy through the trapdoor. If it's 1 million people who are going to die because if you don't push the guy, then this is going to explode and the dam's going to break and all the people are going to die. About the same. 1 million people, 5 people. Your intuitions don't really know the difference. This is what I really wanted to get to. This undergraduate thesis just turned in her work. She went to Tibet and asked Buddhist monks and lay Tibetans about the footbridge case. She also went to, which I just learned, how do I pronounce it properly? Guangzhou, China, and then here in the United States, lay Americans and Christian ministers. The surprising finding, this we knew, people say it's not okay to push the guy at the footbridge, same in Guangzhou, but the Tibetan monks, wowzers, 83% are saying that it's okay to push the guy off the footbridge. This is unlike any population we've ever seen. How did they get there? Well, they tend to say utilitarian kinds of things, better for more people to live, duh. But it's not that they're casual about taking life. It's high on the list of the worst things you can do. Nevertheless, most of these Buddhist monks are saying that it's okay. And a lot of them cited this, I don't know, can you tell me how to pronounce this? That's the one. I'm just going to read this. I think this is important and will connect with what people want to say. So I'm really sorry for going. I totally misjudged the timing on this. But Makarun, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, a bodhisattva ship captain at sea on a long voyage discovers a thief on board who's about to murder his 500 fellow passengers, big ship. The captain finds himself in a moral quandary, for if he tells the merchants of the thief's plan, they will certainly kill the thief and thereby come to suffer terrible karmic consequences for their violent act. If he does nothing, 500 people will die and the murderer will suffer the karmic consequences. The only solution, he concludes, is for him to kill the thief himself and in doing so accept the karmic retribution that will follow his violent act so as to save the thief from the much worse fate. Basically, the bodhisattva pushes the guy off the footbridge and it has a kind of cosmic theory about why, in this sense, it makes sense to do this. And this is the parallel I wanted to get at. The utilitarian philosophy and the Buddhist philosophy ends up being very similar. And one of the interesting strands here is that there's this idea that it's really, this skill and means sutra should be kind of a secret, is what a lot of, at least the Buddhist scholars said. That we don't want everybody going around thinking that it's okay to push the guy off the footbridge. But if you're a bodhisattva, if there are really a lot of lives at stake, then it makes sense to do it. And people have made similar arguments from within the utilitarian tradition. It's not a good morality to have on your brain in everyday life. We don't want you going around pushing people off of footbridges and thinking that that's okay anytime you think the numbers add up. But when it comes to perhaps dramatic situations or larger policy issues, Bentham and the Buddha end up agreeing on what you might call is something like a philosophy that converges on this idea of impartial compassion. So our gut reactions maybe not well suited to the modern world, and perhaps we need to shift into manual mode. When we're dealing with the everyday tragedy, I think a lot of research suggests that our gut reactions are pretty good. But when we're dealing with the modern tragedy, our gut reactions may not be so good, and we may need a kind of meta-morality. That can come in the form of a secular philosophy, but it may also come in the form of a religion that arrives at the similar kind of conclusion that what we ought to be aiming for at the highest level is something like impartial compassion. So thank you, and sorry for going over. People who paid for it, people who did it, thanks for your time. That's okay. Too much excitement. All right.
Okay.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I am going to talk a little bit about the dialogue between psychology and religion. I've done writing and empirical research in this area for about 25 years. Before I start reading, the paper was prompted by a puzzling thing that I've seen, which is that in this dialogue between psychology and religion, some things have worked very well and some things have definitely not worked well. And so this is, to me, an empirical fact, and so I've been trying to think about why is this that some kinds of conversations have seemed to go well and some haven't. So in order to answer that question today, I'm going to try to deploy some philosophical resources. I am, however, a psychologist and not a philosopher, So I feel a little bit like the guy who's got one foot on a dock and the other foot in the boat. So this is a very nice position to be in, to have two sets of resources, but as the boat drifts out from the dock, it can be quite uncomfortable, and we might end up all wet, so hopefully that won't happen. Okay. So, for over a century, Western psychologists and religious practitioners have been interested in dialogue. On the psychology side, William James was deeply interested in religion, and it could be argued that some of his important philosophical doctrines, like the pluralism of the universe, bear traces of his religious studies. Then from the religious perspective, Christian theologians like Reinhold Niebuhr made numerous attempts in the 20th century to dialogue with psychologists, and also individuals interested in practical ministry sought to draw on the resources of psychology to address mental health concerns. But after about a century of these efforts, there's a lot of dissatisfaction on both sides. Psychologists interested in dialogue feel stymied often, claiming, for instance, that psychology is inherently biased against theistic perspectives. And on the other side, there are also problems. For instance, there's documented declining interest in clergy about collaboration between religious professionals and psychologists. So why is this happening? So what I'm trying to do in this paper is to understand this problem from an epistemological and a phenomenological viewpoint through a consideration of three questions. First, is it possible to do dialogue? Can we do dialogue? I see this as an epistemological question. Should we do dialogue? I consider this as a phenomenological question, where we can ask how features of the experience of gaining new knowledge can help us understand the importance of dialogue. And I think it will become obvious that the real transcendence in human thought is an important goal that requires the altering of horizons of understanding. We'll see that dialogue produces a superior way of doing this. Then finally, I'll ask how we should do dialogue, and I believe this is ultimately an ethical question. The traditional approach to understanding dialogue focuses on developing and testing single or competing propositions. I'm going to look at it from an alternative approach of virtue epistemology, which considers instead the epistemic qualities of knowers. So, first question, can we do dialogue? And I see it as an epistemological question, inasmuch as it's an inquiry about whether or not real knowledge can be produced in dialogue. One way of approaching this question is to ask another one. Well, what are the kinds of knowledge that psychologists expect to be produced by dialogue? And can dialogue produce these kinds of knowledge? A non-exhaustive list of the kinds of knowledge that dialogue often tries to produce would include three kinds: propositional knowledge, narrative knowledge, and practical knowledge. Okay. Propositional knowledge, we'll take that first. So in typical analytic epistemology, propositions are thought to be meanings expressed by statements in language that describe and represent a state of affairs, and these propositions are considered to contain knowledge if they provide what's often called justified true belief in the meaning of the proposition. So, for instance, David Lewis, an epistemologist, would describe knowledge as follows. I propose to take the infallibility of knowledge as my starting point. Here is the definition. Subject S knows proposition P if and only if P holds in every possibility left uneliminated by S's evidence, or equivalently, if and only if S's evidence eliminates every possibility in which not P. So knowledge is propositional. In psychology, propositions are judged true or false. These propositions are hypotheses capable of empirical statistical falsification. That is, they are statements of statistical intelligibility that might converge toward the truth. That's Bernard Lonergan's view. And so they might qualify as justified true belief. Typical sample of this way of thinking can be found in an introductory statistics book. Here's Pagano's quote on this. At the heart of science lies the scientific experiment. By some means, the scientist arrives at a hypothesis about some feature of reality. He or she then designs an experiment to objectively test the hypothesis. The data from the experiment are then analyzed statistically, and the hypothesis is either supported or rejected. Notice a couple things here. We're talking about propositions here at the heart of psychology. And the other is this interesting phrase, the scientist arrives at a hypothesis about some feature of reality by some means, whatever that means might be. We're going to come back to that issue. So propositional knowledge like this is the standard kind of knowledge sought in psychology. When we start looking at psychology and religion, an example of this kind of propositional knowledge might be Freud's proposition that involvement in religion and religious beliefs are associated with negative mental health. So this was a proposition that he argued in various kinds of ways. Propositional knowledge then is the standard kind of knowledge sought, but we know from contemporary epistemology and theoretical psychology that there are problems with this kind of knowledge. First of all, establishing secure truth criteria for propositions is a daunting task. There are many debates in epistemology about what constitutes appropriate grounds for justification or what are appropriate knowledge structures, the debate, for instance, between foundationalism and coherentism. So there are no sort of knock-down, win-all arguments here. It's a very open area of debate. B, it's often true that propositions may meet truth criteria but actually be false due to chance, what are called Gettier problems, or other factors like methodological difficulties. C, the representational ability of propositions may be limited. So, for instance, in positive psychology, hedonic or eudaimonic states of individuals may be reduced to single variables with a limited number of values that may not truly convey the richness of a concept like happiness. And D, even when the truth value of a proposition is established, it may lack meaning or significance in important ways. So, for instance, let's take I think a very interesting neuroscience study by Taryn and colleagues that looked at the neuropsychological underpinnings of the link between mindfulness and positive health effects. Based on the results of their study, the authors say this, quote, volumetric analyses showed that higher dispositional mindfulness is associated with decreased gray matter volume in the right amygdala, and exploratory analyses revealed that higher dispositional mindfulness is also associated with decreased gray matter volume in the left caudate. That's the caudate nucleus I think they're referring to. Such volumetric differences may help explain why mindful individuals have reduced stress reactivity and suggest new candidate structural neurobiological pathways linking mindfulness with mental and physical health outcomes, end quote. So interesting study, interesting conclusion. The statements certainly sound like strong and important propositional claims about underlying neurobiological mechanisms. However, a closer examination of this study reveals some interesting things. I'll just, for example, note that when you look at the correlations given in the study between the dispositional mindfulness and the structure size, you get correlations of around minus 0.15 to minus 0.2. So roughly 3 to 4% of the variance in structure size is explained by mindfulness. So we have this very strong propositional statement. When we actually look at the probability and the variance values, this is pretty small. So that's a problem when you read this literature. Now, when we move into dialogue, there are specific problems with propositional knowledge. So, for instance, potential conversation partners may not share an interest in a particular proposition, or there may not be a common propositional language that allows for dialogue. That's an issue that was talked about at our sessions yesterday. When we move further into the dialogue between psychology and religion, we get into even more problems. So G, the difficulties in psychology and religion dialogue are often affected by continuing positivist and abstractionist influences in psychology. The positivist position disallows certain kinds of propositions. So in classical positivism from the 19th century, the law of three stages, the idea is that in human history, we're going to move beyond primitive religious and philosophical ways of thinking into scientific ways of thinking. And so religious types of propositions really aren't worth looking at. These kinds of limitations, you might think that this is a debate in 19th century philosophy, but if you open up the Journal for the Psychology of Religion and Spirituality and you read the instructions to authors who are submitting articles for this journal, you'll read in there that religious concepts cannot be used as explanatory variables in articles submitted to that journal. So there are certain kinds of propositions then that are ruled out, and of course that limits then the kind of dialogue that can be done. Now, I'm not arguing here for propositional skepticism, but I do want to suggest that it's interesting now to look beyond propositions to think about other kinds of knowledge as dialogue, the foundations of dialogue. So I'll talk about narrative knowledge. So narrative knowledge is a kind of knowledge contained in language that links actors and actions together through a plot to convey an important meaning. It matches how some people actually construct knowledge in certain circumstances. A lot of psychologists around the time of the cognitive revolution, Jerome Bruner wrote about this kind of thing. It can be considered a type of knowledge if we follow people like Bakhtin, who argue that the form and content of knowledge cannot be strictly separated from each other, so that knowledge in narrative form is actually a different kind of knowledge than that expressed in propositions. Furthermore, if we judge the success of a type of inquiry by its ability to generate new knowledge, its heuristic value, in a sense, a narrative approach to psychology and religion dialogue seems to be attractive given its track record. A couple interesting examples of narrative knowledge. The first is what you see in evolutionary psychology. While sometimes evolutionary psychology leads to propositional type knowledge, evolutionary analysis do more than this by attempting to tell a story about how various human practices have originated as part of the evolutionary story. Some of these narratives are more interesting than others. One of the very interesting ones, I think, is, for instance, the work that's done by Harvey Whitehouse in what's called the cognitive science of religion. Now, this looks at how evolutionary derived patterns of cognition may assist us in the analysis and understanding religious thought and behavior. This has generated a really interesting body of knowledge, speculation about how religious ideas are transmitted from one person to the next. This area of research isn't without its problems. Studies do find, contrary to prediction, that religious cognition often operates in different ways from other kinds of thinking, but it's still interesting. Another kind of narrative knowledge has been in the conversation between psychodynamic thought and narrative. An example of this would be Rizzuto's work on God image using psychodynamically interpreted narrative data. And this has generated also a very fine body of literature in various kinds of cultural settings, South Asian settings, European settings, North American settings. Narrative knowledge as a type of understanding certainly has strengths. It has a general structure that is more easily shared between disciplines in a dialogue situation, but it also has drawbacks. There's often no reliable way to falsify a narrative or to adjudicate between competing narratives, particularly if they come from different traditions. So narrative knowledge has advantages, but it also has problems. So that leaves us with a third possibility, which is what we can call practical knowledge. Now, practical knowledge is knowledge involving actions that should be done to accomplish important ends in specific situations. This type of knowledge includes the power to attend to important details in situations, as well as make good decisions about how to act skillfully to pursue appropriate goals. This concept, by the way, has a lot of overlap with how psychologists define wisdom. There's an interesting developmental psychology literature in North America and in Europe on this. The practical knowledge framework has served as a basis for a number of excellent dialogues between psychology and religion, particularly with regard to practices that can advance the goal of better mental health. I'll just mention a couple. One of these is the mindfulness literature, where techniques, practical techniques from originally the Buddhist tradition are being brought in and integrated with therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy or dialectical behavioral therapy. Another example would be a wonderful literature on forgiveness. In psychological literature on forgiveness, forgiveness is typically defined as something that someone offers to another person. The person who's doing the offering has been wronged by the person that they're offering this gift to. Psychological research has done a lot to clarify what's involved in the needs and benefits of forgiveness to the individual who's offering forgiveness, what kind of barriers exist in this process, and what kind of practices can encourage it. It's a fascinating literature, several different schools of thought here. The research also has problems. It tends to conceptualize forgiveness as an isolated practice in the same way that some of the mindfulness literature does that. And it also sees as forgiveness as something that you offer to somebody else, not something that you should be asking for from someone else, which is an important distinction, I think. So lots of interesting things happen. I think what this means is that practical knowledge has many advantages as a focus of dialogue. Now, I'm not arguing here that a dialogue ought to be only based on one kind of knowledge. An example, suppose that I'm studying the religious experience of Mr. Y. And Mr. Y tells me a story that he has gained a profound insight while contemplating the koan of Zhao Zhou's dog from the Wumenguan. Now, Mr. Y's story as a whole constitutes a kind of narrative knowledge. But later on, we might learn, either from Mr. Y or from someone else, that he had the experience of enlightenment or insight while he was sitting in a Buddhist temple. It seems to me that this proposition is a kind of statement of fact of the furniture of life, so to speak, and it has implications compared to if we had learned that he had had his enlightenment experience while sitting in a Starbucks in Hangzhou drinking double espressos. Okay? This is relevant to what we would make of the meaning of the experience, I think. So this propositional knowledge then can reflect back on narrative. Okay. So I think that there are lots of ways that we can say that there are kinds of knowledge that can be developed in dialogue, and so that this is something we can do. So should we do it? So I want to turn to dialogue from a phenomenological point of view and the concept of horizons. Okay. This is a concept that's used in hermeneutics and also in phenomenology. Gadamer, for instance, defines horizon as the range of vision that includes everything that can be seen from a particular point of view. A necessary part of consciousness, but horizon really relates then in this way of thinking to possibilities in perception of an object as it could be perceived in the future or anticipated in the future. So this idea that we have a horizon of understanding around us and that there's a fringe to this understanding teases us because there are always things on the fringe here that are possibilities that tempt us to move beyond our current state of understanding. Now, dialogue can have a critical role in the expansion of horizons. This horizon then provides an expectational structure that we bring to the interpretation of experience. So the horizon teases us, but it also draws a kind of line within which we are limited. There's no particular way in which this horizon can be shifted from within, other than by a chance event. But one way it can be shifted is by an experience from the outside, for instance, in dialogue. Paul Ricoeur basically, for instance, thinks that in dialogue, one of the things that happens is we have an experience of what he calls distanciation, which is a recognition that there are other ways of looking at things. And this kind of surprise then can lead us to the experience of appropriation, where we welcome a new perspective. This new perspective then, new possible knowledge, can provide a basis for transcendence. Horizons then can act as transcendent structures because they make it possible for us to perceive more than what is directly sensed. They open up possibilities of future perceptions of objects. Whether these may be relatively mundane extensions of what we know now, a kind of weak transcendence, or whether these extensions are a more experience of what I call strong transcendence, the experience of things that defy comprehension, understanding, and control, okay? And thus have a kind of apophatic quality to them. Horizons can invoke this kind of weak transcendence in moving us, but also this kind of strong transcendence. So if dialogue provides situations that encourage transcendence, it can be an essential adjunct to the scientific method. Science certainly provides novelty, but only slowly as a result of a long process of failed work. In fact, it's not easy to formulate a rational method that will speed this process. Karl Popper, for instance, in his very nice work on this says, "There's no such thing as a logical method of having new ideas or a logical reconstruction of this process." So science can't provide a logical structure for creating new knowledge, for creating new ideas, the kind of discovery, I suppose, aspect of science. So he quotes Einstein that this can only be reached by intuition. And I think dialogue then is something that can create a kind of stimulus to this intuition. Now, in a dialogue, do people then have to agree with each other about everything? Well, I don't think so. Certainly, there is a concern about whether partners in a dialogue share ontological commitments. My argument here would be, which I'm going to cut a little bit short, is that if you're looking at propositional knowledge, people need to share a lot in terms of ontological commitments. But when you look at practices, there's much less need to do this. And so I think that's one of the reasons that dialogues about practices have been much more successful cross-disciplinary than dialogues about propositions. Okay, so last I'd like to ask, how must we do dialogue? And I'd like to point this out, that in traditional epistemology and positive psychology, the answer to this question lies in propositions and the method that we use to verify or falsify them. So technical epistemology. However, this has got problems. So what I'm going to do is use an alternative approach, virtue epistemology, which suggests that it's the quality of the knowers that are the key issue, and so that understanding how to do successful dialogue is really an ethical question. Virtue epistemology, just briefly, based in Aristotle's idea of intellectual virtues, which he argues in the Nicomachean Ethics, and is developed by a number of authors like Linda Zagzebski, for instance. If we look at the knower rather than the procedures for knowing, this has a lot of interesting effects. In traditional epistemology, particularly in science, virtue resides in theories or propositions. So, for instance, Bos von Frossen, philosopher of science, would say, a theory is said to have explanatory power if it allows us to explain, and this is a virtue. It is a pragmatic value, although a complex one that includes other virtues as its own preconditions. But in virtue epistemology, things change. The virtue is now not about, doesn't reside in the proposition, but it resides in the knowers or the disputants in a dialogue. Okay? So if these dispositions in the knower lead to epistemically desirable outcomes, we can speak then of intellectual virtues. Okay. Now, philosophers who develop virtue epistemologies describe a couple of different kinds of virtues, and these could be specific skills or general virtues, which are dispositions that promote good epistemic deliberation and inquiry, like curiosity or open-mindedness, perseverance. Okay. Most of the theories in virtue epistemology focus on these more general virtues. And so in the handout I've given you, this is just a couple of lists of what these general virtues might look like. So in the Nicomachean Ethics, we have the three intellectual virtues, Sophia, Sunesis, and Phroneson Dianotekos. Sorry, my Greek's a little rusty. So these are wisdom, judgment, and practical reasoning. A lot of virtue epistemologists have tried to expand this, and so Robert Roberts, for instance, has this interesting list in the second table, including humility, firmness, autonomy, and generosity as intellectual virtues. Now, and then opposing these intellectual virtues, you can have intellectual vices, which are things that run contrary to epistemic success. Now, intellectual virtues have a couple of obvious relationships with dialogue. First, some of these virtues are inherently communal, and so they make the most sense when epistemic inquiry is dialogical. So, for instance, judgments about others' ideas or generosity in sharing one's own insights both presume a relationship with another person as part of the epistemic process. And secondly, then, of course, the failure of intellectual virtues do more than just retard the production of damage. They can damage these relationships. Humility, I think, is particularly important because important to transcend, an individual must be able to listen and attend, to self-evaluate, and to change. None of these can happen without humility. So humility is a foundation for mutual respect, which is highly desirable in the situation of dialogue. In science, the problem that we're susceptible to, the vice, I guess you'd call it in this kind of a framework, is scientism. Arthur Peacock defines that as the attitude that the only kind of reliable knowledge that is provided by science, coupled with a conviction that all our personal and social problems are solvable by enough science. Okay? This is, you can see some of this in the psychology of religion literature, kind of Whig histories of the field that are written, and kind of dismissive attitudes that you can see sometimes. But scientism is not a necessary part of science. In fact, it's contrary to typical scientific values like openness and a willingness to self-examine. And these are very compatible with humility. So, in conclusion, dialogue is certainly a possible and desirable undertaking, but clearly some conditions are conducive to dialogue while others make it more difficult. Okay? So just highlighting some issues that are relevant to my own field. So it's clear to me that the focus on propositional knowledge is often an impediment in the dialogue. We need to move beyond and to be a little more creative. And this doesn't mean abandoning topics. So for instance, here, take religious experience. Here's 3 different possible projects that could be done. A study to verify the proposition religious experiences are nothing but an epiphenomenon related to abnormal temporal lobe activity. Or a project to collect and study narrative accounts of religious experiences and the impact they had on the individual. Or an investigation to see if the practice of centering prayer might assist Christians suffering from anxiety problems. So there's no reason that we could close the door to different topic areas, but there are different ways of approaching it depending on the kind of knowledge that we would like to seek. Corollary, going to the virtue epistemology, is that humility then, I think, needs to be an enduring part of dialogue. People who bring humility to the epistemic enterprise, this helps them be respectful of other parties, to understand that mutual benefit is involved in these interchanges, so that parties in a dialogue will speak to each other in a conversation. I'll close here with a quote from Paul Ricoeur. Language is itself the process by which private experience is made public. Language is the exteriorization, thanks to which an impression is transcended and becomes an expression, or in other words, the transformation of the psychic into the noetic. Exteriorization and communicability are one and the same thing, for they are nothing other than this elevation of a part of our life into the logos of discourse. There, the solution of life is, for a moment anyway, illuminated by the common light of discourse. Thank you.
I'm sorry, is that okay?
That's okay.
Sorry.
Steal my
Were you
thunder.
all geared up? You know, I can go second, I'll be fine.
Okay,
That's
all right,
that's
Justin,
ready.
go for it.
ahead.
Oh, no. Okay, well, all right.
Oh,
In that
that's
case-
great, yeah, I don't think we'll go that way, just so.
You
you ready?
Oh, no.
So first of all, I'd like to thank everyone, the CSWR, the director, the staff, our wonderful 2 presentations. They really were wonderful, and I just have to say that, in fact, they were so wonderful that as a respondent, I'm kind of at a loss of what to say in terms of at least giving a summary or a critique. No summary or critique could really do justice to the depth and sophistication of your thought, so instead, I'm going to offer what I'm going to call an epistemic return gift, where in return for your gift to me that led to this thinking, I'm going to give a return gift, and since I always tend to give gifts from Asia, this one will be no different. So for my response, I offer a brief examination of how Buddhist monastics might deal with this question, how can we do dialogue? Especially the issues of ethical dialogue and moral persuasion. My hope is that seeing some of these issues deployed in a different context, although we did actually see some Buddhist context, so that's cool, might allow us to see them in a new light. So first, ethical dialogue in monastic Buddhism. So many of you, I got it upside down, sorry. Many of you might tend to think of Buddhist monks like this, right? Solitary, engaged in meditation, aloof from the world. But in reality, the lives of most monks are more like this, engaged in various types of dialogical interactions, from the formal to the informal, teaching sessions to discussion circles. Consequently, monastic traditions have long been concerned with the complexities and difficulties of producing effective ethical dialogue, and that concern is expressed in certain monastic texts. I hope to demonstrate with the following examples that Buddhist traditions have thought really long and hard about how humans tend to behave in the world based on their emotions and their moral dispositions. So I first turn to an instance of reflection on the ethics of speech from a teaching called the Teaching to Prince Abhaya from the Pali Canon. Now the Teaching to Prince Abhaya records a conversation between the Buddha and Prince Abhaya, obviously. The story goes that the prince had come to the Buddha at the instigation of a rival teacher with evil intentions. Prince Abhaya's goal was to catch the Buddha in a lie, which would be a blow to his moral authority and his ability to maintain a monastic following. So during this conversation, the trick doesn't work, of course, and during the conversation, the Buddha lays out his criteria for engaging in an ethical dialogue. Based on that, I've made this following chart. This chart has 6 rows, 1 through 6, and 7 columns, A through G, and columns A through B come directly from this teaching. Columns A, B, and C are the 3 conditions for an ethical dialogue to occur. So in the form of questions, they are, is the dialogue true and correct? Is the dialogue beneficial? And is the dialogue welcome and agreeable? We can see that only 2 combinations, rows 3 and 6, which I've highlighted, lead to an ethical dialogue. These are the 2 where the highest gains accrue, where what Professor Green calls in his book, the magic corner. And I could even say, using some of his words from today, that row 3 here is the hell row, and row 6 is the heaven row, right? Hell keeps you in line, heaven draws you in. It works very well, I think. So one interesting feature of this is that propositional knowledge, column 1, forms a crucial part of any ethical dialogue. The 2 Pali words used here at the bottom, if you can see it, bhuta for true and pacha for correct, leave no doubt that these refer to empirical truths. Although Buddhism is famous for its so-called doctrine of emptiness, certain aspects of reality can in fact be put into propositional statements, capable of true-false validation. So the most well-known example of this would be the proposition of the First Noble Truth, the truth of suffering. So the proposition suffering exists validates as true. The propositional knowledge of column A underlies column B. The Pali word here for beneficial is attasamhita, which means connected with a goal. So, for instance, based on the truth that suffering exists, right, there comes to be the goal of the cessation of suffering. The combination of these 2 leads to a regime of practice that efficaciously leads from suffering to the goal of non-suffering. So we could say that column B is a practical epistemology based on column A, which is a propositional epistemology. Furthermore, the efficacy of such dialogue, inasmuch as it is an intersubjective endeavor, depends on a critical understanding of how people tend to behave in the world. This moves us to columns E through G, which coordinate forms of speech with emotions and moral mechanisms. And these are my own hypotheses, not from the text. and inspired by Professor Green and Professor Nelson's work. So these are not only, so we see here that ethical dialogue is not only individual practice, but also a means of social cooperation. So why is this important? Well, the monastic community is effectively a volunteer organization that is founded upon the freely given cooperation of its members. So there's two subgroups within the monastic community. There's monks and nuns who are celibate ascetics, and laymen and laywomen who are householders. Right? The householders provide the material support for the ascetics, and and moral persuasion is used to maintain this flow of material support. So, in the remainder of my response, I'm going to tell two stories, one virtuous and one deviant, about the use of moral persuasion along these lines to gain cooperation. Okay. The first one, all right, is about Mahakashyapa and Ananda and the eating of alms food. So, in a teaching called The Ordination of Mahakashyapa, two prominent monks from the Buddha's lifetime, Mahakashyapa and Ananda, engage in an ethical dialogue about the rules surrounding eating alms food. Their conversation arises from a breakdown in cooperation. So here's what happened. Ananda has a large following of 500 monks. One day, 30 of those monks decide to renounce his teaching and indulge in sexual pleasures. Mahakashyapa hears about this, and he goes to enforce discipline. He's a very strict monk. And he does that in the only way possible, through dialogue and moral persuasion. Their conversation is a formal one, guided by etiquette. So it's a formal ethical dialogue. After a set of greetings and pleasantries, they sit down in a formal arrangement, and Mahakashyapa asks a leading question. He asks, quote, "What think you were the several benefits," same benefit from the chart, "what were the several benefits which the Buddha saw in prohibiting disciples from eating in a crowd, and prescribing that they should eat in groups of 3? Ananda is very polite, and he responds that, "I would come a long way to ask you this very same question." And so Mahakashyapa then continues, well, there's 2 benefits. One, quote, "It conduces to the protection, safeguarding, and comfort of householders." And 2, quote, "It conduces to the breaking up of cliques of wicked monks, stopping them from banding together out of greed, and from causing dispute, wrangling, squabbling, quarreling, contention, and mischief within the monastic community," end quote. So at stake here is clearly the cooperation of the monastic community. The lack of discipline surrounding the eating of alms food caused the 30 monks to indulge in sexual pleasures, right? Harming themselves and setting a bad example for their fellow monks. More than that, it also potentially tarnishes the monastic reputation, which endangers the cooperation upon which the cooperation of the laity in giving them food. So this phrase, protecting the householders, really means ensuring that they're giving to virtuous monks. Now, Ananda, of course, readily sees his fault and admits his mistake. But Mahakashyapa must also persuade these novice and rookie monks, right? So he makes a further moral argument based on his own virtue. He tells the gathered monks the story of his ordination by the Buddha. Now, Mahakashyapa's ordination was unique. It happened early in the Buddha's career, and it involved the Buddha recognizing him as an equal, symbolized by the exchange of robes, which an act not done with anyone else. So the story really exemplifies the virtue of Mahakashyapa, and therefore the propriety of its admonitions, his speech. After the story, he declares, quote, "And now, O Ananda, whosoever of these 500 monks harbors doubt or mistrust of me, let him ask a question, and I, in answering the question, shall roar a veritable lion's roar." Of course, no one says anything. Everyone keeps quiet. Right? Then Mahakashyapa gives them a teaching and goes away, leaving them, quote, "instructed, roused, gladdened, and thrilled." Right? End of story. So on the basis of this story, I filled out my chart in the following manner. Right? The first dialogue with Ananda took the form of an explanation from a trusted source. Ananda, recognizing his fault and his danger, right, feels remorse, paliyotapa. And this is a particular emotion that's an aversion to transgressing the rules and also a virtue of any monk or nun. The dialogue with the 500 monks, on the other hand, takes the form of an exemplification that provokes wonder, both because Mahakashyapa represents an ideal ascetic to be imitated, and also because of his unique history with the Buddha. So the monks are therefore persuaded by their awe for him. So I tried to use some of the same terms that were used in Professor Green's presentation: loyalty, awe, that sort of thing. Right? So the same moral mechanism that allowed for this cooperation to happen, which moves us to the magic corner of cooperation, can also be abused by a deviant monk, right? But it still works. And one type of monk that does this is called the schemer, and his moral strategy is called rejection of robes, right? And then what follows is a slightly modified translation from a text called the Mahani-Desa and the Pali Canon. So this is a quote, a long quote. What is the instance of scheming called rejection of robes? It is when householders invite monks to accept robes, and one with evil desires, prey to his desires, wanting robes, actually refuses robes because he wants more. He says, what has an ascetic to do with expensive robes? It is proper for an ascetic to gather robes from the cremation grounds, from the rubbish heap, right, and make them into a patchwork cloak to wear. Accordingly, this monk wears coarse robes. Then the householders think, oh, this ascetic has few desires, is content, is secluded, keeps aloof from company, and is strenuous, and is a preacher of asceticism. And they invite him more and more to accept robes. He says to them, well, when three things are present, a faithful householder produces much merit. When faith is present, a faithful householder produces much merit. 2, when goods to be given are present, a faithful householder produces much merit. And 3, when those worthy to receive gifts are present, a faithful householder produces much merit. Now you have faith. The goods to be given are here, and I am here to accept. Now if I do not accept, then you will be deprived of good merit, and that's no good to me. So rather, I will accept out of compassion to you. Accordingly, he accepts many expensive robes. Such scheming, schemery, and schemedness is known as the instance of scheming, called rejection of robes. So based on this story, I can fill out my chart like this, right? The schemer is actually using the same moral machinery to get the robes that he secretly desired all along, using loyalty and awe. He proclaims himself as a virtuous ascetic, very similar actually to Mahakashyapa. And he does not technically lie at any point. The statements he makes about the virtues of wearing rags and the compassionate necessity to accept gifts are all actually true. But his intention is rooted in greed, not in compassion, which makes it harmful, not beneficial. It is harmful to the monk because it feeds his greed. Moreover, were the laity to discover his scheme, it would severely harm the monastic reputation, leading to a decrease in cooperation. But in this case, his scheme still works because of the efficacy of the underlying moral mechanism. So I think these stories resonate with some of the issues raised by Professor Nelson and Professor Green about ethical dialogue and moral persuasion. And I've tried to use some of their vocabulary to indicate that fact. The study of moral persuasion and cooperation in monastic communities could be a promising avenue for critically evaluating theories derived from laboratory experiments in Western settings. And we actually saw an example of that very nicely. It would seem to offer an interesting test case, to say the least. More than that, the corpus of monastic literature may contain genuine insights into human psychology and behavior, perhaps suggesting new theoretical directions or modifications to existing concept maps. For instance, the list of emotions that are so supposedly universal to all humans could be, checked with the monastic texts. So this could advance the conversation by introducing new horizons, new points of view, perhaps leading to what Professor Nelson called a weak form of transcendence that would expand our knowledge in a productive way. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you all. These are very interesting, thoughtful presentations and a very interesting, thoughtful response. Let me respond to Josh first with some concerns and questions. One of them is the way in which morality is understood, and it does seem to me that you're using morality in a number of different senses, and that there is a tendency to equate morality and moral reasoning. And there's a long tradition of this, as you know, in moral psychology, and Kohlberg certainly conflated morality and moral reasoning to a high degree. And it came to dominate the field. And my concern about it is that, and why I think it's relevant to this discussion is, I know 7-year-old girls who I think of as more moral than some of my Harvard colleagues. And the reason isn't because of their capacity for moral reasoning, it's because I think they're more generous, they're more empathic, they have deeper ethical commitments to people, they have a stronger moral identity in a sense. You also, and I may be misunderstanding, but you seem to be saying that there's less capacity for high-level reasoning in religious communities or quick reasoning. And again, I may be misunderstanding the correlation between reasoning and religion. And, again, it just seems to me that religion is producing so much, could conceivably be producing so much else that enhances people's ethical commitments to people outside the tribe or outside the in-group. And I guess two things about this. That one, I think some religions do produce strong ethical, universal moral commitments. What was the other thing I was going to say about this? Anyway, let me see if I can remember. I'm trying to collect my thoughts about a number of things that you said. I know what it was. It's that individuals also have different relationships to religion, right? So individuals can adhere to religion very dogmatically, or individuals can adhere to religion in a way that is not dogmatic, that recognizes that religion can inform universal principles of fairness and justice, and sometimes they don't, and they're able to view religion critically. So it seems like people's relationship to religion is also very important. You talk about the modern moral problem as being one of negotiating terms of cooperation, which seems accurate to me. I just wanted to suggest, though, that I think we have a couple other very big modern moral problems. I'd be very interested in both of your thoughts about this. One is, in our research, one of the things that we find is that when we ask children to say, what's most important to you? And we say that we ask this question a number of different ways, through a survey, but also qualitatively. Being a happy person, having high self-esteem, being a good person who cares about others, achieving at a high level. We ask them, how do you imagine your parents would rank those things for you? How do you imagine your peers would rank those things? Your teachers would rank those things. And caring and goodness is ranked last. Achievement and happiness achievement's now ranked first, unlike 8 years ago. Happiness is ranked second. But I think the degree to which we have elevated achievement and happiness as the goals of child raising and demoted morality is unprecedented in the history of our country. I mean, this just was not true prior to 1960 or 1970. So the issue of the degree to which morality is a priority or an important part of the self, I mean, a strong part of one's moral identity seems central to me as well. The other thing that I see in my work and my practice with kids is that we hardly ever tell kids that morality is important for its own sake. And I was trying to connect this to your work, and I'm not sure exactly how this is connected, to the sheep. But there's this idea, that, and I found myself doing this with my own kids when they were young. I would say, I used to coach basketball, pass the ball because then someone will pass the ball back to you. Or be nice because then someone will be nice to you. Or take care of the other person's sheep. And again, I'm not sure I'm connecting this in the right way, because it will be good for the common good. But that's different from saying you should pass the ball because it's right to pass the ball, because it's important for somebody else. You should be nice because it's important to be nice. And I worry that in the culture we have lost the sense of just morality for its own sake. Be moral to be moral. Be right to be right. A question about the argument about biology, and again, this was my first time responding to this, so I may not have gotten it quite right, but it was the argument you were making about distance, and you were saying that, if I understood it correctly, that, in a sense, the closer you are, the more likely you are to act morally, and that has a biological basis. It seems to me it could have a biological basis, but it could have other bases as well. So, some people, I think when I talk about development of moral identity or the importance of these values like caring, fairness, generosity to the self, some cultures cultivate a strong moral identity, and some cultures cultivate more of a moral identity or more of a sense of moral awareness for people who are distant than people who are close. So it seems like more than biology is going on here, although biology might be a part of it, but I was interested in your thoughts about that. Another question about context, fast and slow, really interesting research, but I wondered how true this is across different contexts. You're asking a particular context. I don't know what the data is like across multiple contexts and whether you see the same thing across multiple contexts. And finally, let me just offer a few thoughts to Jim and your very interesting and thoughtful presentation. And just to step back for a minute, I mean, part of what I am concerned about here is I do think, I'm going to get to your paper, I do think of the context for moral development as evaporating. That schools in this country, public schools, were founded to create good citizens. They were about character. Private schools, almost always, were about creating moral character in kids. They are not about that anymore. They are about achievement. Participation in boys, as far as I know, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, Boys and Girls Clubs, religion is evaporating. These contexts for moral development are also evaporating. Schools as a context for moral development are also evaporating. So this is something like I'm very concerned about in the big picture. And I think that there are things about religion that are very important. There's a way religion speaks to child development or psychology in this context. And that's that, and you know, religions can be good and bad in all kinds of ways. It depends what religion we're talking about. But the religions created a moral narrative for families and for kids, and they created practices and rituals, which seems connected to the argument that you're making. And that, you know, in religious communities, there has been a fusion of a moral life and a spiritual life, which I think, you know, is very important in terms of moral identity, in terms of feeling like you have obligations to your ancestors and obligations to your descendants. There have been rituals like confirmation, bar mitzvah, in which kids engaged in ethical reflection and made ethical commitments of one kind or another. There have been, you know, parables, moral questions in which kids engage with adults in ethical questions. There have been ethical adults, and there are, I shouldn't use the past tense, there are religions in which there are communities of adults who stand for important principles and reinforce those principles. There is the validation of suffering as a path to wisdom, and one of the things, moral wisdom, and one of the things we see in our data is that a lot of kids think self-esteem or happiness is the foundation for morality. I mean, it's not, I've always thought suffering was the foundation for morality, but a lot of kids have this sort of oxygen mask on the airplane view, that you have to fill yourself up first, and then you can have something to give to your neighbor. So my point is, and Josh made the comment about guilt and hell, I mean, that religion, I think, has served these very important functions in terms of child development. And I'm not arguing that every kid should be religious. I am arguing that if there is an evaporation of religion, we should really think about how do we reproduce some of these aspects of religion in secular societies. How can we strengthen them within religious cultures, but also how can we reproduce them? The rituals, the narrative, the ethical questions, the community of adults, the fusion of some kind of moral life and some kind of spiritual life. Thank you.
Well, respecting that Richard can't stay too long, I'll try to be brief in my comments so we can all get some responses in also. Thanks for the great presentations, and it's really fun to have people come across the country and across the yard to talk to us. A few things that I wanted to note are the ways that the study of religion sort of situates itself right now as sort of a near enemy to psychology, as another discipline that's emerged to think about humans as more than rational creatures, as both rational and more than rational. So there are ways of being that are humorous, that are bodily, that are filled with desire, that relate to suffering, and that can't be explained by scientific or positivist or utilitarian ways of making decisions. So I think that richness that our disciplines has in common could be an important resource for more dialogue. And the psychoanalytic tradition in particular has been an important conversation partner for religion, to think about how certain behaviors function even if they are not rationally prescribed behaviors. So perhaps you would think about forms of non-reasonable behavior, like asceticism, that still serve an individual's status in society or helps them fulfill certain emotional or religious needs. So that kind of respect for a sort of a non-reducible capitalist actor, I think, should stay in view. Another aspect I wanted to put forward is the way that the sort of the game theory context strikes me as so devoid of culture and power, of the ways that often when we're going into negotiations, we're aware of who in our context can do us favors or who can undermine us, or who we need to respect and fear. So it seems like the conclusions we can draw from whether we put money into the pot will tell us certain things in the abstract that in reality are usually more relationally determined in longer term relationships. And things like gender and age, economic status, are resources that religion wants to bring into that conversation, and ethnicity. So I think that the interest of religious studies in critical cultural theory, in the ways that power operates, what's validated and what's not, the ways that certain ideas are exported from traditions such as mindfulness, that can be orientalizing, that can be a way of sort of fetishizing and consuming culture. Those are critiques that religious studies can be useful in helping to make of the functional, practical application of psychological ideas. So I guess I see spaces where there could be conversation and also sibling chiding of one another for the kind of ways that we admire and are concerned about one another's relationship to these rich cultures and ways of being.
Professor Green, would you like to respond?
Sure, thanks, and thank you for your thoughtful responses. So let me start by responding to Richard. So first, the question, the idea of equating morality with moral reasoning. I must have not done a good job of making this clear, because I certainly don't equate morality with moral reasoning. On the contrary, I think that most of everyday moral life does function and functions best when it's done in an intuitive kind of way, and that I think is the lesson of a lot of the laboratory and sociological research. And so, you know, if you remember in the experiment with the public goods game and the time pressure, it's the people who are thinking a lot who are contributing less. And I think that sounds a lot like your virtuous 7-year-old versus the professors who are perhaps thinking a little bit too much when it comes to problems of me versus us. So I would say, on the contrary, I think that morality as a natural phenomenon is primarily an emotional and an intuitive phenomenon. And that if there's a place where abstract moral reasoning is most useful, it's in the peculiar kinds of modern moral problems that we face as a result of modern technology. So for example, abortion and things like that, or the coming together of different cultures that have different intuitions about how we ought to live together. But I didn't mean to suggest that morality is or should be primarily about moral reasoning. Likewise, I certainly didn't mean to suggest that it's not possible to be a very reflective and thoughtful religious person. I mean, you know, this institution, the Divinity School, is a testament to the I think obvious fact that caricature is false. I do think, however, that it is worth considering. You know, what does it mean if we find that on average, and that it's only on average, that as people are more reflective, at least as measured by this one measure, which has its limitations, they're less likely to believe in God? I think that it's probably not that people are rejecting the idea of community and caring about other people and a lot of the major social messages that religion brings. I think a lot of what people are probably rejecting are, in some sense, the mythological aspects of religion, the things that a lot of people who are educated have a hard time believing in. And I think maybe a lot of what's going on with religion now is sorting out what are the central social and moral messages, and to what extent can they be decoupled from myths that are very hard for people to believe when they live in a pluralistic world and they live in a world that's informed by scientific knowledge about how things got to be the way that they are. I actually think this observation about this shift in terms of children being seemingly more interested in their own happiness and in their own achievement as opposed to being moral, I think it's a really interesting development, and I think that it's one that makes a kind of sense in terms of the framework of the two tragedies that I presented, which is to say, if you live in a small-scale society, which is what most humans did for most of history, being a good person is largely about being unselfish and being willing to do for others. And the odds that you're going to invent some new technology that's going to be transformative and bring vast wealth to your tribe are vanishingly small. Whereas the odds that you can be a selfish jerk are quite high. And so a lot within a tribe, moral education is largely about having a kind of humility and concern for others. And then you get to the modern world where there are these competing tendencies. On the one hand, we want people to be humble and to put others ahead of themselves. But in the modern world, there's potential where if you think you're really smart and you have the confidence and the drive to go out and achieve something, you can not only achieve great things for yourself, but you can also bring those resources back to the people who you care about most. And so I think that in the modern world where there's this wider marketplace to compete with outside of the tribe, there's this tension between be big, go out and conquer, and be small, or at least don't be too big, because you have to live in a community with other people and you're not the only one who counts. And I think that Mormonism is a particularly interesting case with respect to this. I don't know, I'm not an expert on this by any means. This is my own casual observation, but my casual observation is that it seems like this is a religion that is navigating this tension in a very proactive way, that it's part of the Mormon ideal that you should be a humble, good citizen within the tribe, but it's also part of the Mormon ideal that you should aspire in some ways to be like Mitt Romney, and to go out into the world of business or whatever it is and conquer and succeed, and by the way, bring some of those resources back to the church and to the tribe. But the main point I want to make is I think that this tension that you see, it is troubling. I also think it's interesting and perhaps explicable in terms of some of these larger social forces. I just, to clarify, I certainly didn't mean to suggest that our tendency to help or not help people on the other side of the world is a purely biological phenomenon. I think there's almost no interesting human behavior that doesn't have an important cultural component. And if I didn't think it had a cultural component, if I thought it was all biologically determined, I wouldn't tell you about it, because there'd be nothing we could do to change our behavior. So part of my interest in this is not in saying, here's what's biologically fixed, tough noogies. It's saying, here's what biological tendencies we may have, but we are in the driver's seat, and we can decide which of these tendencies do we want to endorse and reinforce, and which of them do we want to try to overcome. I have further responses to Mara, but I worry that I've taken up too much time already. So I maybe I'll.
I just have to go.
Yeah,
Leave it at that.
sure. You guys work it out here, and then and then you can go.
Josh, we have 5 minutes to work.
The 5 are all yours.
No, I really appreciate these clarifications, and let me be a little more precise about a couple things. I mean, part of what I was reacting to is like just the term morality fast and slow, because I don't think you're really talking about morality fast and slow. I think maybe you're talking about moral cognition.
Moral judgment, yeah.
Or moral judgment,
yeah.
Fast and slow. But also that there's, in these moral decisions, but just like in life, it isn't just about moral cognition or moral judgment. It is about, well, 2 things. It's about the messiness and contextual factors that go into any moral judgment, that the emotions, as you say in another slide, that all these emotions, shame, guilt, rage, envy, all these emotions are interplaying with our moral judgments. Culture, context are interplaying with our moral judgments. And I wasn't sure if you would, it seems like you clarified, but I wasn't sure you agreed with that.
Of course, no, I do, absolutely.
Think about that, but it seems like an important thing to think about in this context. I also, when you're comment about religion, I know you think people are in religion are thoughtful and reflective, but I was saying something a little different, which is that maybe in terms of our capacity to be good and decent and moral people in the world, there's a lot about religion that is super important, and that if we look at religion within more of the context of moral judgment, it may take us toward a more negative view of religion than we want to have. And if we look at religion within the context of many different moral domains, in terms of managing difficult feelings, moral identity, moral awareness, a whole set of other moral domains, it might create for us a very different picture of religion.
How do you come to the conclusion that it's biology that's making us throw away the Oxfam article, or the sort of plea for money in that culture?
Well, so any traits that we have as a result of natural selection operating over genes must be the result. It is an inherently competitive process. So any biological trait that we have it because it enabled our ancestors to outcompete other individuals, other groups who didn't have those traits. And that's just the fact about how biological evolution works, that there is nothing that results from biological evolution that isn't a competitive advantage. Now, some of these things operate at the individual level. So why are lions strong and fast and have big sharp teeth? Well, the individual lions who had those features were able to outcompete the ones who didn't have them as much. There are other traits that operate in a social context. So our willingness to cooperate with others, to be nice, to care about those around us, those are essentially traits that are from a biological perspective about teamwork. But the reason why they can evolve is because they enable some teams to outcompete other teams. So from a purely biological perspective, it would be impossible for us to evolve a concern for distant strangers on the other side of the world, because distant strangers on the other side of the world are, from a biological perspective, the competition. So there's just no way that biology could, on purpose, so to speak, get us to that kind of a disposition. It could only be as a byproduct, as an accident. That said, I always have to add, just because something results from from evolution doesn't mean that it is fixed or immutable, or that trait has to be what dominates our behavior. So a lot of people think if it's biological, that means that it's hardwired, and that's simply not true. But that's the explanation for why I think it could not be that concern for the well-being of distant others is something that we are biologically disposed to have.
But if someone gave you a cultural explanation of why, we've been raised to see our pile of mail and think about American cultural imperialism and think about how far $200 goes and
Right.
overhead, couldn't you give a different explanation of what's happening in that decision making and have to say these are two competing
I would say not
explanations?
competing. I would say complementary. I think that that some cultural practices reinforce the biological disposition that's already there, and some cultural practices can run counter to a biological disposition. But I don't think those two explanations need to be in competition with each other.
I guess I'm just not, it seems like the biological description takes away a curiosity about how we come to make moral decisions, because we see it as somehow produced at a non-conscious universal level, as opposed
This is my concern too, just to clarify.
The worry is that if we think it's biological, then
we're not looking at the ways that we, as sort of Nicomachean ethics, like certain virtues are being instilled in us by our culture from our very first days, and that we're watching adults around us, we're having certain rewards and punishments being observed in our culture, and then we grow into certain habits that are conscious and unconscious. And so I don't see any reason to see that as biological. It may be consistent with a biological explanation, but if we give the biological explanation, then we lose this kind of ground of inquiry.
right. Well, so my view is I'm not going to believe in whether a biological explanation or not, because I think it's it suggests doing something that's good or bad. I'm interested in the truth, and either it's true or it's not.
Oh, we got our difference.
And so to me the first question is it true or not, and what is the evidence? Now, as it happens, I don't think that there's any reason why accepting the biological explanation needs to make us undervalue or fail to appreciate the important role that cultural influences, including broader cultural influences, as well as the teachers, the parents and teachers. I don't think that those, as I said, I don't happen to think that those are in competition. That is an empirical question from my point of view. It is in theory possible that once you believe that something has some kind of biological component, that leads to terrible consequences because people accept that explanation and go, behave in bad or counterproductive ways. I don't think that that's true, but in principle you could convince me that here's a scientifically knowable truth that we should try to not believe. Maybe there are situations like that, but to me the first question is it true or not? Not, are there negative consequences to believing it?
But I guess I'm confused because it seems to me that you're saying that it is true that biology is interacting with all these other factors.
I certainly believe that it's true. I think there's good evidence for it, but there's always room for doubt.
Yeah. And it does seem to me to matter what you elevate, and that you have elevated biology in this. And if that's empirically true, you should be elevating biology. But it's not clear to me that it is empirically true.
Yeah, I gave you evidence that biology is only part of the story, right? So I talked about all of the cities around the world and how people have radically different outcomes. My assumption there is that it's not genetic differences between people in Athens and Copenhagen that are accounting for those results. It's differences in culture. So I think that culture is enormously powerful in shaping people's behavior, but that cultural influences operate in conjunction with biological predispositions.
I think we all agree about that.
Yeah.
We can end on that note.
Do you have any responses to anything that was said before we open it up for questions?
Sure. As Richard's leaving, I guess one of the things that I hope people would take from the paper that I did is that we're all in this room educators, and we're all responsible for, in one way or another, helping people become good epistemic agents. And we have to think about what is the best way to do that. And I think traditionally we separate reasoning from character or moral development. And I think when you look at virtue epistemology, then that says that that's a false dichotomy. That if we're interested in educating people who are knowers and learners, we have to pay attention to their moral qualities, because that's part of the whole enterprise.
I agree with you about that. I wasn't saying they're dichotomized. I was saying they're these very different moral domains that we have to pay attention to.
No, I think I completely agreed with everything that you said. I'm just reinforcing that point. Yep. And so we have to ask, what can we do to do that? But then also, is there a way in which our efforts are going to fail unless we have some kind of a broader context, cultural context, religious context, that supports the development of those kind of virtues? I think that's an enormously important question. So, Mara, to respond to yours, the issue that you raised is really the whole issue of reductionism. And I think that's a very critical thing. Reductionism is a kind of two-edged sword. I mean, we simplify things so that we can understand the world.
Right.
And so, this is very important to do. But if we simplify things too much, we no longer understand the world. And so where do you find that kind of a balance? Science, I think, in psychology has traditionally been biased toward, if you're going to err on one side or other, you err on the side of reduction. And I think that's had unfortunate consequences for the psychology and religion dialogue, because that's a particular area where I think you really want to err on the other side. It's very difficult to reduce a lot of those things to very simple kind of statements. So, which I think I'm just agreeing with what you said.
Right, and you acknowledge it in your paper about Dr. L and Mr. P, or whoever it is, about the desire for simplicity on the one hand and the desire for accounting for particularity on the other.
Right. So I agree with that. Justin, I had a lot of interesting questions that were raised for me by listening to what you had to say. So it was terrific. So one of the questions that my paper leaves unanswered, but I think is an important one, is if you buy this idea that there are different kinds of knowledge, okay, and that different sorts of dialogue or investigations might involve different kinds of knowledge, the question remains, well, what's the relationship between these different kinds of knowledge? So, for instance, when you were talking about Buddhist communities, you made a statement that seemed to me to imply that kind of at the foundations of things, there are propositions. There's a kind of propositional knowledge that people in the community accept as true or false, and that this is important. I guess I just want to ask the question, first of all, is that true that the basis of a community is propositional knowledge? So, for instance, some religious communities, you could argue that actually it's narrative. Or you read Dogen, and Dogen would say, well, what is it to be a Zen Buddhist? Well, it is to practice. So if you want to use a foundational scheme, I think you have to think about, well, which of these things is actually at the bottom. But then you could also argue that foundationalism is a little iffy, and that really what you're looking at is some kind of more complex picture where narrative and practice and proposition kind of play off each other in some kind of a complex way, which is, I think, a fascinating possibility, but very complicated to try to understand. And maybe different religious systems or cultural contexts provide different matrices for those kind of interactions. I don't know. That's just kind of a... That was just a question that was raised for me by your talk, which I have no explicit answer to. Those are the best kind of questions, maybe.
Should I answer that?
So.
Would you like?
Well, I'll just quickly say that in that chart where propositional knowledge was kind of the foundation, the way that I came to that statement that you were quoting is that there's combinations left out of that chart in which if the first column, true and correct, is false, then actually you can't proceed to the second column of beneficial. So there seems to be, they're not truly independent variables, column A and B, whereas column C was an independent variable. So that actually only has to do with ethical dialogue, so that's when that truth condition comes to the front. In terms of just everyday living in a community, of course, that's not necessarily necessary, and I think you're right that there's a kind of a dynamic between those different epistemologies, because really the way you come to this knowledge about suffering exists is you're supposed to realize it in your own life, which takes place through your own practices and through your own narrative and whatnot. So you see yatha bhutam, right, as it really is, you see suffering. So it's less of a ceding to some proposition in terms of belief than it is that really you're just supposed to see this for yourself in your own life. But yeah, I think the way to look at it is that there's a complex relationship between those different epistemologies, including virtue epistemology.
Context by dropping out the narrative and the practice. I think many people in religious studies would suggest that actually can't work. That the evidence from the study of religion is these three linked: the propositional, the narrative, and maybe I'm misreading you. But I wanted to just ask another question, if I might. I understood you basically be saying that the capacity of the Buddhist monks and of Bentham and Mill to sort of engage in a kind of disinterested thought that allows them to scale up to the level of humanity is necessary at a kind of post-tribal moment that we're in which the cooperation across tribes is necessary. It seems to me that, in a sense, what you're doing is shifting the tribe to a new level of tribal community, so that the human would then be the new tribe. And that what you're doing is asking us to sort of reimagine, to do what we used to do at the tribal level now at the human level. Exactly. And so my question is, on what ground is that the right move? And is that possibility that we're going to create a new tragedy of the commons through that tribal move, which then drops out? Why is the survival of the human species necessary or a good thing? And from what point would you argue that? And I think there are certain ways the Buddhist tradition might argue that, but
Well, let me start with the beginning. So, I
I didn't mean to suggest that practice and narrative would have no role sort of in kind of philosophical or metamoral approach. I view it as an empirical question of what actually works and what doesn't, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if for things to work on the ground, it can't be grounded just in abstract principles, but it has to be woven into people's intuitive thoughts. And I think that the way people develop intuitions about what to do in any given situation is from stories, narratives that sort of make you say, aha, this is like the case of whatever that story that I learned when I was a child, and that indeed is how the Buddhist monks are responding.
Which depends on the myths that you are seeming to dismiss.
The myths.
The myths.
The stories.
Well, so I mean, what the interesting is you can believe in the lesson of a story in terms of its applicability to what I should do right now, without necessarily believing that in fact God did create this flood, or in fact, or whatever it is. So there's the literal truth of the narrative, and then what you might call the higher moral truth. And what I was suggesting is that perhaps the reason why reflection sort of pulls people away from belief in God to some extent, it's a statistical correlation, not by any means a determinative fact, is trouble believing in the myths literally. And some people deal with that by saying, well, this whole thing is bunk, and other people deal with that by saying, well, it's not literally true, but there's an important moral truth to it, and that's still applicable. And that seems to me to be quite possible. Your other question about on what grounds am I saying that it's good for people for the human race as a whole, let's say, or human species to survive, and I would add to be survive and to be happy. I'm just kind of taking that as a given, I think. And I wouldn't limit it just to humans. If the aliens come, friendly or otherwise, then we may have an even more complicated, higher level problem on our hands. But
We may destroy the planet before the aliens come. It's the tragedy the commons
Right.
are concerned about.
Right. Well, that's the tragedy. That's what I'm trying to solve. So you said, what if it creates a new tragedy? To me, the point of this is to avoid the tragedy that we're currently possibly headed towards. So I don't see that problem as a product of the meta-morality. I see that as the problem that a meta-morality, if it's successful, will solve.
We might disagree there, but I think I'll just stop.
Okay.
Any other questions, Charlie?
Hi, my name is Charlie Carsons. I'm a PhD student in study of religion here at Harvard. I want to ask a question that was slightly related to the last, specifically this idea about scales of society.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about this distinction you made in particular about how these smaller scale communes perhaps are more effectively cooperative when they're religious as opposed to secular.
Right.
And then I imagine that in the kind of larger scale society that we're living today, something like religion may not promote that kind of cooperation because of the issue of diversity. Right. We just have all these different tribes living together, right?
Exactly.
So my curiosity is how we might imagine this transition point, right? At what point does a tribe or a certain group of communities get large enough that we say religion doesn't work anymore and we have to be secular? Is it a kind of radical transition? I mean, what I suspect, and here's an alternative model, is that it's less that societies become secular and perhaps they change the ways in which they use religion to actually cooperate. So one of the examples would be something like a certain scale society would draw more on hell narratives because that's more effective for, instilling cooperation when there are interpersonal relations between people. And I suppose the implication of that alternative narrative would be that secular society is really just the same religious society, but with a different kind of face that's appropriate to that kind of scale. Right? So we live in a secularized Christian society, so to speak. So religion has a particular face when it reaches a particular scale. Right. So at the end, I don't know if there's a clear distinction between what a secular mode of cooperation would look like or a religious mode.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense to me. I mean, that certainly even within societies that are relatively secular, they bear the stamps of the religious traditions that were prominent there, right? I also don't think it's not necessarily the case, although this seems to be the trend recently, that everything eventually becomes secular. I mean, there are two ways that things can scale up, broadly speaking. One is the old tribal religions just get ditched,
and we all become secular. The other is that the tribal religions evolve into pan-tribal religions, and I think in some sense, Christianity was a move in this direction. That is as being more inclusive relative to other religions that were around at the time. And you may be seeing this kind of expansion even further in other religious traditions. So one way to do this is to have a strong public-private distinction. So you take someone like Obama, who is, I believe him when he says that he really is a deeply religious person, but he, like many people living in our society, draw a line between private faith and the public sector and say, I may believe what I believe and this is important in my life and how I make my choices, but if I'm going to justify my views on abortion or whatever it is to other people, I have to do this in secular terms, even if my ultimate conviction is informed by my faith. And so one way to do it is just be secular. Another way to do it is to have a division between my private religion and the public sort of marketplace of ideas, and another is to have a religion that ends up scaling up. So I think an aspiration of the Unitarian Universalist tradition is, look, here's a religion that really could be, as the name suggests, universal, right? That it really is an explicitly post-tribal religion, and I think that there are strains of that in certain aspects of Buddhism. So I think there are different ways of trying to scale up, and I agree with your claim that even what looks like a purely secular scaling up can actually be deeply informed by the religious influences that preceded it.
I have a question about some pop culture ideas around what you're talking about with how folks are connected to helping others. I'm thinking in particular, of course, we saw it with the marathon bombing, how much money the one fund raised, but I think a less traumatic situation that I'm curious to hear your thoughts on is, I'm not sure if folks saw this video of this school bus chaperone who was being mercilessly bullied by the students. She was like in her 60s. The kids were throwing things at her, saying horrible things to her. It went viral, and it was all over the news, conversations around children and their behavior, but more importantly, pity for this teacher, or, chaperone. And she ended up getting a donation of $800,000 through something like GoFundMe. And I'm curious about what you think about that in particular, but also more generally these websites that try to connect. I think Kiva's another one of them, where you can invest in a particular farmer or family in Buenos Aires or some small Peruvian village. And I'm curious about what you think about sort of why people are doing that, how that is a break from that distance idea.
I think that I think connecting it to that aspect of the research makes perfect sense, and there's other research that connects it, I think, even more directly. So some researchers did an experiment where they were essentially soliciting donations, and in one version of the experiment, they describe a girl named Rokia in sub-Saharan Africa and described her situation, and would you like to make a donation to help her or other children like her? In another condition, they gave statistics about the problem of poverty and child malnutrition in Africa. And in a third condition, they gave told both Rokia's story and gave the statistics. And it turns out that the most effective for eliciting donations was pure Rokia. Right. That if you add the statistics, it actually makes it worse. Right? And I think this relates to this idea that we are not designed to be morally motivated by statistics. We're designed to be moved by personal, relationships, if not a close personal relationship, at least a relationship with another person that we can identify as another person. And this relates to Mara's point about the kind of sterility of some of these laboratory experiments. And that's why I think it's important to gather evidence both from the lab and from the field. And I don't want to give too long an answer to your question, but I think there's field evidence to suggest that some of what we're learning in a somewhat reductive, reduced kind of way from these experiments also fits with the richer and messier data that we get from out in the world. But I think that that's a really interesting connection, and it fits well with a lot of the research on this.
Do you have any bibliographic suggestions for those of us who are interested in those that try to bring the kind of laboratory studies together? Do you have anybody in particular to suggest?
For reading, you
For
mean?
reading, yeah.
So Ara Noren-Zion, whose work I mentioned, has a book out. I think it's called Big Gods, or The Evolution of Big Gods. And basically the story that I told with his data and other people's data is told in that book. And the idea of, you know, and the book I think came before that I mentioned earlier, which developed these ideas as, you know, religion as a cooperation device that can be both, pro-social and anti-social. It comes from David Sloan Wilson's book, Darwin's Cathedral. In terms of more specific work on religion, I think, yeah, probably those two books, and our recent book, I think, really synthesize a lot of interesting work. And I recommend in general the work of Azim Sharif, who's Ara Noren-Zion's student. And I'm sure I'm forgetting a lot of important stuff, but at least those are good places to start, I think.